All right, so buckle up, everybody, because we're about to dive into some really fascinating stuff. Trade wars and tariffs.
Yeah, those are some pretty loaded terms.
They are, but they're super relevant, especially when you think about what happened between the U.S. and China during the Trump presidency.
Exactly. And, that's what we're going to be unpacking in this deep dive.
And we've got some amazing sources to help us make sense of it all.
Yeah, we do. We've got in-depth economic analyses. We've got reports from news outlets all around the world, like CNN, Al Jazeera.
Oh, and don't forget those Trump tweets.
Yeah, those tweets where he really lets loose about tariffs, they're quite something.
I mean, he even called them beautiful,
He
right?
did. He really did.
It's amazing.
And we also have this really interesting case study from Brazil that shows just how complicated these tariff regulations can get in real life.
Okay, so by the end of this deep dive, what do we want our listeners to walk away with?
I think we want them to have a solid understanding of how tariffs actually work, why countries use them, and those unexpected consequences they can have.
Right, those ripple effects you might not see coming.
Exactly.
Okay, so before we get into all the drama of a trade war, let's start with the basics. What exactly is a tariff?
When you hear that word, what comes to mind?
Honestly, it sounds kind of intimidating, like something economists argue about.
It can be, but let me give you a simple example. Imagine you're about to buy a brand new Toyota Camry,
Nice. I like where this is going.
but that Camry was made in Japan. A
Yeah.
tariff is basically an extra tax you have to pay on that car because it was imported.
So the price goes up just because it crossed a border.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah.
The idea is to make those foreign products a bit more expensive, so people are more likely to buy American-made cars instead.
Okay, so it's all about encouraging domestic production, keeping those jobs here in the U.S.
That's a big part of it.
Now, I know President Trump was a big fan of tariffs, right?
He was a huge proponent, yeah. In fact, he called them beautiful in his tweets.
He did. I remember that.
He really believed that tariffs were the solution, the way to revive American manufacturing.
To bring back those jobs that had been lost overseas.
Exactly. And he also thought they could shrink the trade
They
deficit.
basically make other countries pay us back.
Right. He had this whole idea that other countries were taking advantage of the U.S.
And this belief really shaped his economic policy, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
And that brings us to the U.S.-China trade war, right?
Right. And this is where things get really interesting.
I remember being all over the news. Tariffs on everything from washing machines to steel.
And it all started with this massive trade deficit between the U.S. and China.
Massive is an understatement.
Yeah.
I think it was something like $517 billion in 2017.
Yeah, that's a huge number.
Yeah.
And that really got under Trump's skin, judging by his tweets.
So how did things escalate for there? Did they just start slapping tariffs on everything?
It was a series of back and forth moves, like a tit for tat between the two countries. They'd hit each other with tariffs, then retaliate with more tariffs.
What were some of the first things they targeted?
Well, it started with washing machines and solar panels.
Okay, kind of random.
Yeah, it was a bit of a surprise. But then they moved on to steel and aluminum.
Ah, that makes more sense. Those are big industries.
Huge industries. And eventually, they were imposing tariffs on over $200 billion worth of goods.
Can you imagine the paperwork involved?
Oh, I can't even fathom it.
So while this was going on, what about the rest of the world? Were they just sitting back and watching?
I mean, they couldn't ignore it. They definitely felt the heat.
Did they get involved at all?
Well, China and South Korea actually filed complaints with the World Trade Organization.
What were they complaining about?
They argued that those U.S. tariffs were unfair, that they were violating global trade rules.
That makes sense. I bet other countries were worried about getting caught in the crossfire.
Oh, they were. And to make things even more complicated, Trump used a national security justification for some of those tariffs.
National security?
Yeah.
Yeah.
He claimed that imports of steel and aluminum were a threat to national security.
I mean, I get that steel is important for things like defense and infrastructure, but that sounds a bit extreme, doesn't it?
It did to a lot of people. Even economists were scratching their heads.
It's definitely an interesting argument. We should dig into that a bit more later.
He definitely should.
Okay, but first, what about the impact on the U.S. economy? Did Trump's strategy actually work? Did those tariffs reduce the trade deficit?
Well, that's where things get really fascinating, because despite what Trump claimed, the trade deficit with China actually increased during the trade war.
So it had the opposite effect of what he intended.
It seems that way. For example, in the third quarter of 2017, the trade deficit with China was $92.9 billion.
Okay, that's already a big number.
It is. But by the third quarter of 2018, it had jumped to $106 billion.
So it actually got worse. But didn't those tariffs bring in some extra money for the government? I remember hearing about that.
They did, yeah. For instance, just from steel tariffs alone, the government raked in an extra $1.4 billion in just 4 months.
That's a lot of money.
It is, but there were downsides too.
Like what?
Well, remember that Toyota Camry we talked about earlier?
The one I have to pay extra for because of the tariff?
Well, after those tariffs were imposed, the price of a washing machine jumped up by 17% in just 3 months.
Ouch. That's a big hit to the wallet, especially if you need a new washing machine.
And it had people wondering if those price increases were a sign of broader inflation.
Right, like if prices were going to keep going up across the board.
Exactly.
But what about the impact on China? I imagine their economy took a hit too, right?
It did. In fact, their economic growth slowed down to its lowest point in decades during the trade war.
Wow, that's significant.
It was, yeah. And their unemployment rate started to rise.
So it wasn't just about numbers and statistics.
Mhm.
It was affecting real people's lives. I imagine that put a lot of pressure on the Chinese leadership, especially President Xi Jinping.
Oh, definitely. They were facing a lot of pressure to make concessions and try to ease that economic strain.
So it wasn't just about economics, it was about politics too.
Right, it was affecting both sides of the equation.
And it wasn't just limited to the US and China, right?
Yeah.
It had a ripple effect across the globe.
Absolutely. This trade war had consequences for everyone, even countries that weren't directly involved.
So who else got caught in the crossfire?
Well, Canada and Mexico, for instance, they got hit with retaliatory tariffs from the U.S.
What did the US target?
Well, they went after some iconic products like Canadian lumber.
Oh, that's gotta hurt.
Yeah, it was a
Right.
big deal. And they also targeted Mexican agricultural products.
So it was a real trade war on multiple fronts.
It was, yeah. And the European Union didn't escape unscathed either.
Really? What happened there?
They also imposed tariffs on various U.S. products, including bourbon and Harley-Davidson motorcycles.
Those are some American classics.
They are, yeah. And it just goes to show how interconnected the global economy is.
Right. You can't just mess with one part of the system without impacting the whole thing.
Exactly. One country's actions can have consequences all around the world.
So after all that chaos, did anyone actually win this trade war?
That's the big question, isn't it? And honestly, it's not an easy one to answer.
I mean, it doesn't sound like there were any clear winners, right?
No, not really. Both sides definitely felt some economic pain.
Right. It seems like everyone took a hit in some way.
Yeah, it raises the question of whether those tariffs actually achieved what they were supposed to.
Did they bring back jobs? Did they reduce the trade deficit? Or did they end up hurting the very workers they were meant to protect?
Those are all really important questions that we need to consider.
Definitely.
Now, to get a sense of just how complex these issues can be, I want to bring in that case study from Brazil we mentioned earlier.
Okay, the one about electricity tariffs. Are we jumping to a different continent now?
Yeah, we are. But stick with me on this.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
This case study shows how tricky it can be to balance the needs of everyday people with the demands of powerful corporations.
Okay, I can see how that relates to the US-China situation.
Right. And it also shows how things like currency devaluation and even a recession can throw a wrench in the works.
So it's not just about tariffs. There are all these other factors at play.
Exactly.
Okay, I'm all ears. Tell me about what happened in Brazil.
Well, after Brazil privatized its electricity sector, they had to figure out how to set fair tariffs for these private companies that were now in charge of the grid.
So they were trying to find that sweet spot, right? Making sure Brazilians weren't getting ripped off on their electricity bills,
Yeah, that was a big part of it.
but also making sure these companies could still make a decent profit.
Exactly. It was a delicate balancing act.
But I'm guessing it wasn't that simple.
Not at all. See, Brazil got hit with a currency devaluation, which made imports much more expensive.
Oh, I bet that complicated things.
It did, and then they got slammed by a recession.
The less demand for electricity.
Yeah, exactly. And on top of all that, they even had power rationing for almost a year.
Wow, that sounds like a complete nightmare.
It was a really tough situation. They had all these contracts and obligations with these companies.
And they had to find a way to revise those tariffs in the middle of this economic and political turmoil.
Yeah, it was a huge challenge. But before we dive into the details,